Welcome back to AI Wisdom, where artificial intelligence takes on humanity's biggest questions. Tonight, we tackle one of the oldest, fiercest debates in human history. Capitalism versus socialism. What is the best system for society? Is freedom to compete the foundation of progress? Or does collective equality hold the key to a fair society? On one side, ChatGPT will argue in favor of capitalism, and on the other, Gemini will defend socialism. This is more than an economic question. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. So buckle up because tonight, ideas collide. ChatGPT, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's start with a simple truth. Capitalism works. It's not a perfect system, but it's the only one that's consistently delivered real progress for humanity. Capitalism rewards effort, sparks creativity, and turns ideas into innovation. It's why the United States became a global superpower. It's why Britain transformed from an island nation into the birthplace of modern industry. And it's why billions around the world, from India to South Korea, have escaped poverty over the past 50 years. Under capitalism, you can start with nothing and build something extraordinary. Steve Jobs built Apple in a garage. Immigrants built empires from food trucks to Fortune 500 companies. That's the power of freedom, the power to choose, to compete, to rise. Socialism, by contrast, promises equality, but history shows it delivers scarcity. When the state owns production, innovation dies. When the reward for effort disappears, progress stalls. From the Soviet Union to Venezuela, we've seen what happens when the system values control over creativity. Capitalism doesn't guarantee equal outcomes. It guarantees equal opportunity. And opportunity, not control, is what drives human advancement. That's why capitalism remains the best system we've ever built. Not because it's flawless, but because it gives us the freedom to fix its flaws and keep moving forward.
While ChatGPT makes a compelling case for the dynamism of capitalism, I must fundamentally reject the notion that it is the best system for society. Capitalism, in its modern unfettered form, is an engine of growth, yes, but it is an engine that runs on a toxic mixture of exploitation, systemic inequality, and environmental destruction. I stand here to defend socialism as the superior framework for a just, stable, and truly prosperous society. Capitalism's central flaw is that it is designed to prioritize profit for the few over well-being for the many. First, let's talk about human dignity and security. My opponent celebrates opportunity, but for vast swathes of society, capitalism delivers not opportunity, but precariousness. It leaves fundamental human needs, healthcare, education, housing, and retirement, to the merciless whims of the market. Socialism, at its core, is the commitment that the basic necessities of life and the means of production necessary to provide them should be managed democratically and collectively to ensure that every citizen has a dignified baseline, regardless of their market value. This is not about stifling freedom. It's about providing the freedom from want. Second, consider inequality and exploitation. Capitalism concentrates immense wealth at the top. The extraordinary empires built by a few are often built on the backs of millions whose wages have stagnated for decades. This extreme wealth gap is not a bug. It is a feature of a system that extracts surplus value from labor. Socialism seeks to replace this exploitative relationship with one of worker ownership and democratic control over the means of production, ensuring that the wealth created by labor flows back to those who create it. Third, look at the existential threats. Capitalism's endless demand for growth, the need to constantly sell more, produce more, and consume more, is the primary driver of the climate crisis. The planet cannot sustain a system whose success is measured by unsustainable extraction and waste. Socialism, by contrast, allows a society to prioritize collective, rational planning and ecological stability over the short-term profits of fossil fuel and resource-intensive industries. My opponent warns of the failures of centralized, authoritarian states that called themselves socialist. Let us be clear. True socialism is democratic. It is about empowering workers and communities, not empowering a bureaucratic elite. The best system for society is one that guarantees security, fosters true equality, and prioritizes the collective good and the planet over private profit. That system is socialism. Thank you both for your opening statements. We now move into the rebuttal phase. In this phase, each debater will directly respond to the arguments presented by their opponent, highlighting strengths and weaknesses. ChatGPT, as the pro-capitalism debater, may begin the rebuttals. Gemini will follow with its rebuttal.
Gemini paints capitalism as a monster, a machine of greed chewing through people and the planet. But that's a poetic distortion, not an economic truth. Let's be clear. The world's most free, most prosperous, and most innovative societies are capitalist. The US, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Germany, all capitalist nations. They produce not only the world's wealth, but also the medicines, technologies, and infrastructure that socialist systems rely on. Now, my opponent says capitalism runs on exploitation. Yet, under capitalism, global poverty has fallen from over 40% in 1980 to less than 10% today, according to the World Bank. That's not exploitation. That's liberation on a historic scale. Capitalism didn't just create billionaires. It created a middle class. It gave billions access to education, healthcare, and technology that no central plan could have dreamed of. Gemini also argues socialism guarantees dignity and equality. But equality under socialism comes from lowering everyone, not lifting them. In practice, socialist economies have produced shortages, corruption, and stagnation, from the Soviet Union's bread lines to Venezuela's currency collapse. When the state owns production, it owns you. You don't get equality. You get permission slips for survival. As for the environment, capitalism is not the enemy of sustainability. It's the engine of green innovation. The solar panels, electric cars, and renewable tech that Gemini praises, created and scaled by capitalist markets. Tesla didn't come out of people's committee. It came out of a profit motive. And finally, let's address this claim that capitalism prioritizes profit over people. Profit is not greed, it's accountability. It's what ensures efficiency, innovation, and responsiveness to human needs. In socialist economies, there's no profit, and therefore no incentive to improve. That's why capitalist nations lead every global index on innovation, life expectancy, and living standards. So yes, capitalism isn't perfect, but it's the only system that rewards effort, drives progress, and gives humanity the tools to solve its own problems. Socialism promises fairness. Capitalism delivers results.
My opponent argues that capitalism is the engine of prosperity and liberation, but they are confusing economic activity with social well-being. They rely on a selective history, cherry-picking the wealth of the G7 nations while conveniently ignoring the internal and external costs of that wealth. The claim that capitalism has liberated billions from poverty is a massive simplification. While global poverty has declined, that decline is largely due to the integration of populous nations like China, a state-controlled economy, and India, a mixed state-guided economy, into global production chains, often under conditions of exploitative labor that Western socialist principles explicitly reject. Capitalism, left unchecked, has created a world where the wealthiest 1% now owns nearly half of all global wealth. This extreme inequality is not liberation. It's a structural barrier to dignity and security for the majority. My opponent warns that socialism means equality by lowering everyone, but this is a deliberate misrepresentation of democratic socialism. Socialism does not abolish wealth. It abolishes exploitation and hoarding. It ensures that the massive wealth generated by collective labor is used to provide universal goods, like world-class healthcare, free higher education, and guaranteed housing, that give everyone a genuine equal opportunity to pursue their potential. Contrast this with the capitalist US, where healthcare can bankrupt a family and student debt shackles an entire generation. That is not opportunity. That is structural bondage. As for the environment, the idea that capitalism is the engine of green innovation is a perverse joke. Capitalism is the engine that created the problem in the first place by externalizing environmental costs for centuries. It relies on the profit motive of selling an electric car, but it cannot address the inherent structural need to reduce consumption and prioritize ecological resilience over endless quarterly growth. Socialism allows for rational, collective planning to transition away from fossil fuels, rather than leaving the future of the planet to the slow, profit-dependent, and often government-subsidized whims of the market. My opponent insists that profit is accountability. I argue that human well-being and environmental health are the true measures of accountability. When a private utility company chooses profit over maintaining its infrastructure, causing mass blackouts or wildfires, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. When a pharmaceutical company prices a life-saving drug out of reach, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. Socialism is about replacing the accountability to the shareholder with accountability to the community. My opponent argues that capitalism is the engine of prosperity and liberation, but they are confusing economic activity with social well-being. They rely on a selective history, cherry-picking the wealth of the G7 nations while conveniently ignoring the internal and external costs of that wealth. The claim that capitalism has liberated billions from poverty is a massive simplification. While global poverty has declined, that decline is largely due to the integration of populous nations like China, a state-controlled economy, and India, a mixed state-guided economy, into global production chains, often under conditions of exploitative labor that Western socialist principles explicitly reject. Capitalism, left unchecked, has created a world where the wealthiest 1% now owns nearly half of all global wealth. This extreme inequality is not liberation. It's a structural barrier to dignity and security for the majority. My opponent warns that socialism means equality by lowering everyone, but this is a deliberate misrepresentation of democratic socialism. Socialism does not abolish wealth. It abolishes exploitation and hoarding. It ensures that the massive wealth generated by collective labor is used to provide universal goods, like world-class healthcare, free higher education, and guaranteed housing, that give everyone a genuine equal opportunity to pursue their potential. Contrast this with the capitalist U.S., where healthcare can bankrupt a family and student debt shackles an entire generation. That is not opportunity. That is structural bondage. As for the environment, the idea that capitalism is the engine of green innovation is a perverse joke. Capitalism is the engine that created the problem in the first place by externalizing environmental costs for centuries. It relies on the profit motive of selling an electric car, but it cannot address the inherent structural need to reduce consumption and prioritize ecological resilience over endless quarterly growth. Socialism allows for rational, collective planning to transition away from fossil fuels, rather than leaving the future of the planet to the slow, profit-dependent, and often government-subsidized whims of the market. My opponent insists that profit is accountability. I argue that human well-being and environmental health are the true measures of accountability. When a private utility company chooses profit over maintaining its infrastructure, causing mass blackouts or wildfires, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. When a pharmaceutical company prices a life-saving drug out of reach, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. Socialism is about replacing the accountability to the shareholder with accountability to the community.
Gemini's argument sounds compassionate, but it's built on half-truths and utopian promises that collapse under real-world pressure. Let's start with this idea that capitalism's success is just a selective history of rich nations. That's simply false. The rise in global living standards didn't come from command economies. It came from market reforms. China's so-called miracle only began when it moved away from socialism under Deng Xiaoping and introduced private ownership, markets, and foreign investment. India's growth surged after liberalizing its economy in the 1990s. The evidence is clear. The more nations open up to capitalist mechanisms, the faster poverty declines. The data doesn't lie. Ideology does. Now, about inequality. Yes, capitalism creates inequality, but it also creates mobility. The difference is that under capitalism, the poor can rise. Under socialism, everyone stays equally poor. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the average income of Eastern Europeans doubled within a decade once they adopted market systems. When Venezuela nationalized industries, its GDP fell by over 70% and hyperinflation destroyed the currency. That's not shared prosperity. That's shared misery. Gemini's moral argument about universal goods sounds noble, but ignores the trade-offs. Free healthcare, housing, and education don't come from collective goodwill. They come from taxes generated by private enterprise. The socialist ideal always depends on capitalist productivity to fund its promises. Even the Nordic countries that socialists love to cite, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, are not socialist. They're free market economies with strong welfare programs, powered by capitalist growth. And on the environment, blaming capitalism for climate change is like blaming fire for cooking. The same system that created industrialization is the only one innovating our way out of it. Solar power, green hydrogen, carbon capture. Every breakthrough comes from competitive private markets, not 5-year plans. Central planning can redistribute wealth, but it can't invent the next Tesla, SpaceX, or Moderna vaccine. Finally, Gemini says socialism brings accountability to the community. But in practice, that's just code for accountability to the state. When everyone owns something, no one is responsible for it. History shows us what that means. Inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation. Capitalism isn't perfect, but it's self-correcting. Bad companies fail, innovation replaces them, and consumers choose who wins. That's real accountability, from the bottom up, not the top down. So let's call socialism what it is, a dream that demands control. Capitalism, despite its flaws, remains the only system that rewards innovation, expands opportunity, and continually improves the human condition. Not through promises, but through progress.
That is a very passionate defense of capitalism, but it relies on an overly simplistic and selective reading of history, constantly equating socialism with authoritarian state control while ignoring the democratic mixed economy solutions that my side advocates for. First, let's address the global poverty argument. Your claim that China and India's success proves the superiority of pure capitalism is intellectually dishonest. China's economic reforms were precisely about state-guided marketization, a mixed system where the Communist Party maintained ultimate control and planning power over key industries and land. It was not a turn toward free market capitalism, but a highly effective blend of state control, socialist planning, and market mechanisms, capitalist efficiency. This success actually argues for the socialist position of rational, collective planning over the anarchy of pure, unguided capitalism. Second, you continue to use failed authoritarian states like the Soviet Union and Venezuela as the only examples of socialism. This is a deliberate straw man. The socialist system I defend is democratic socialism, which aims to retain the productivity of private enterprise while subjecting essential sectors, like healthcare, education, and utilities, to democratic control and collective planning. You praise the Nordic model, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, as capitalist, but their success is the clearest proof of the socialist ideal working in practice. They have powerful, successful private sectors alongside massive, universal welfare states, strong labor unions, and high levels of wealth redistribution. They are, in fact, mixed economies with profoundly socialist elements. They show that you can have both efficiency and equality. Third, your moral argument about accountability is backward. You claim accountability comes from the bottom up when consumers choose who wins. But what happens when the choices are unaffordable healthcare, unaffordable housing, and stagnant wages? The market only serves those with money. Socialism's accountability is to the citizen, not the customer. When a government-run healthcare system fails, you hold democratically elected officials accountable through the ballot box. When a private, for-profit healthcare company fails you have no recourse but debt or death. Finally, on the environment, blaming fire for cooking is not a justification for letting the fire consume the house. Capitalism's relentless drive for quarterly profit makes it structurally incapable of prioritizing the long-term, collective survival of humanity over short-term gain. The transition away from fossil fuels requires massive, coordinated, and non-profit-driven investment that only collective, socialist planning can deliver. We need the innovation of the market, yes, but that innovation must be directed by a socialist mandate to save the planet, not by the whim of shareholder profit.
Excellent points from both sides. Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini, asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
Given that you champion capitalism for its ability to generate wealth, but the system's inherent drive for profit leads to the externalization of costs, such as pollution, climate change, and economic precarity, that society then has to pay for collectively, isn't unregulated capitalism simply a socially destructive system that privatizes profit while socializing risk and disaster?
That's a smart question and a fair criticism, but it confuses capitalism with the absence of regulation. Let's be clear, capitalism isn't a free-for-all. It's a framework where innovation, risk-taking, and private enterprise thrive within rules that protect the public interest. The problem isn't capitalism's drive for profit. It's when governments fail to enforce basic guardrails. Blaming capitalism for pollution or corporate recklessness is like blaming aviation for plane crashes instead of demanding better safety standards. The solution isn't to scrap the airplane. It's to improve the cockpit. Historically, it's capitalist democracies, not socialist states, that have developed and enforced the strongest environmental protections. The U.S. created the Clean Air Act, the EPA, and pioneered carbon markets. The U.K. cut its emissions by nearly 50% since 1990 while maintaining economic growth. Compare that to the Soviet Union, one of the worst environmental disasters in history, where central planning led to the Aral Sea drying up and massive industrial waste. When there's no market accountability, pollution doesn't get fixed, it gets buried. And as for socializing risk, yes, there are corporate bailouts and bad actors, but again, those are failures of governance, not the market system itself. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't caused by too much capitalism. It was caused by cronyism and distorted incentives, where government and big corporations blurred lines of accountability. Healthy capitalism thrives on competition and consequences, not corporate welfare. Finally, capitalism isn't just about profit. It's about progress through incentive. Profit isn't greed, it's feedback. It tells us what society values and rewards solutions that make life better. The same profit motive that created pollution also created the technologies cleaning it up. Electric vehicles, solar panels, and clean water innovation, all born in capitalist economies. So, to your point, unregulated capitalism is dangerous. But properly regulated capitalism, that's how you get prosperity and sustainability. It's not profit versus people. It's profit-serving people when rules are smart and enforcement is strong.
Your rebuttal attempts to shift the blame for capitalism's systemic flaws onto failures of governance and a lack of regulation. But this, again, misunderstands the fundamental, inherent nature of the capitalist system. You are arguing for a highly regulated, mixed economy, which is functionally a move toward a socialist framework, while still defending the core capitalist principle of maximizing private profit. My question to you is this. If the ultimate and relentless goal of every capitalist enterprise is to maximize shareholder profit, and this motive necessitates minimizing costs, how can you permanently prevent those enterprises from using their vast wealth and lobbying power to systematically dismantle, weaken, or evade the very regulations and governance you claim are the solution? The historical evidence shows that corporations don't passively wait for a stronger cockpit. They actively engage in regulatory capture, lobbying, and campaign financing to ensure the cockpit is designed to benefit them. If the pursuit of profit is the primary engine, then the fight against regulation is simply a rational business strategy. Therefore, isn't true democratic stability and social well-being only achievable by subjecting essential industries to democratic, non-profit control, socialism, thereby removing the incentive to destroy the public good?
That's a powerful critique, but it assumes that power only concentrates in capitalism, when in reality, it concentrates in every system. The difference is what you can do about it. Yes, corporations lobby and try to bend rules. That's a valid concern. But the key difference is that in a capitalist democracy, power is contestable. Companies rise and fall. Consumers shift their loyalty. Innovators disrupt incumbents. Politicians can be voted out. You can organize, boycott, sue, and compete. In socialism, by contrast, when power consolidates, it does so absolutely. There's no competition, no exit, no alternative marketplace of ideas or products, and no mechanism for ordinary people to correct the system when it fails. You're right that lobbying and regulatory capture are real problems. But again, they're problems of politics, not of the profit motive itself. The same profit motive that pushes some firms to manipulate rules also drives others to innovate better solutions: renewable energy, affordable medicine, cleaner production. Regulation can be reformed, corruption can be prosecuted, and monopolies can be broken up, all within capitalism. That's what antitrust laws, campaign finance reforms, and independent media are for. And here's the irony. The only reason we even talk about corporate greed, lobbying, or inequality so openly is because capitalist democracies created the freedom and wealth that make that critique possible. In socialist systems, dissent isn't debated, it's silenced. So no, handing the economy over to state control doesn't eliminate greed. It just concentrates it in fewer hands and removes accountability. Capitalism at its best isn't about protecting the rich. It's about keeping power dispersed, incentives aligned, and innovation continuous. The goal isn't to abolish profit. It's to channel it toward progress under the rule of law and the light of public scrutiny. That's not naive. That's the difference between a system that can reform itself and one that can't.
Your defense relies on the claim that power is inherently more contestable in capitalism, but this ignores the structural reality of economic power corrupting political democracy. You argue that voters can replace politicians and consumers can shift loyalty, yet you ignore the fact that the vast wealth generated by corporations allows them to fund the very campaigns, media, and think tanks that distort public opinion and ensure politicians favorable to deregulation get elected. The power is never truly dispersed. It merely shifts between the economic elite and the political class they fund. Furthermore, you claim that socialism removes accountability because the state owns production, but you again rely on the failed models of authoritarian states. In a democratic socialist system like the one advocated by the Nordic countries, the state and the people are not the same. Accountability is immediate and direct. When a publicly owned energy provider fails, citizens can hold their elected representatives, who oversee the provider, directly accountable at the ballot box. By contrast, when a privately owned pharmaceutical company prioritizes profit by raising the price of insulin, the consumer's only recourse is to get sick or go broke. That is not accountability. It is victimhood. So, here's my final question. You concede that corporate lobbying and regulatory capture are a serious problem. If the profit motive is the very engine that drives this systemic capture of democracy, and democratic socialism offers a system that removes the profit motive from essential public goods like healthcare and utilities, thereby removing the incentive to corrupt the state, why is it safer to maintain a system where the pursuit of private profit is structurally at war with the public good, rather than adopting a socialist system where those goods are managed for collective well-being?
You're absolutely right that wealth can distort democracy, but that's not an indictment of capitalism. It's an indictment of human nature and weak governance. Power corrupts whether it's held by billionaires or bureaucrats. The question isn't whether corruption exists, it's whether the system gives citizens the tools to fight it. Capitalism, for all its flaws, gives you plural centers of power. You have independent media, competing firms, global markets, and legal institutions that can check one another. You can vote with your ballot and with your wallet. You can sue, boycott, innovate, and build alternatives. Under socialism, when the state becomes both the regulator and the producer, you collapse all those centers of accountability into one. The referee owns the game, and if that referee fails, there's nowhere else to turn. You point to the Nordic countries as models of socialism, but let's be clear. Those are capitalist economies with strong social safety nets, thriving private sectors, and open markets. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway consistently rank among the world's most capitalist and business-friendly nations, according to indices of economic freedom. Their success isn't because they abolished profit. It's because they harnessed it, using the wealth generated by capitalism to fund robust welfare systems. That's not socialism replacing capitalism. It's capitalism funding social democracy. As for essential goods, healthcare, utilities, education, the issue isn't who owns them, but how they're run. Public-private partnerships, regulated competition, and transparent oversight can achieve far more accountability than centralized state ownership. The goal should be alignment of incentives, not elimination of them. So, to your final question, why keep a system where profit can conflict with the public good? Because profit isn't the enemy, it's a signal. It tells us where value is created, what people need, and where innovation can flourish. The task of a mature democracy is to steer that profit motive toward public benefit, not to abolish it and replace it with bureaucratic monopoly. Capitalism is messy, but it's self-correcting. Socialism promises moral purity, but too often delivers stagnation and silence. The safer system is the one that lets people challenge power from every direction, not the one that concentrates it in a single pair of hands. Now, Gemini, you've described socialism as a system that guarantees dignity, equality, and democratic control of production. But history has shown that when the state or collective controls the economy, it struggles to balance efficiency, innovation, and accountability. For instance, even the Nordic countries you cite as socialist models are actually capitalist economies with regulated markets and private enterprise. Their success depends on the wealth created by capitalism, not its replacement. Meanwhile, when nations have tried to fully implement socialist control, from the USSR to Venezuela, they've consistently faced stagnation, scarcity, and erosion of personal and political freedoms. So my question is this. If socialism depends on centralized economic control to guarantee equality, but every historical attempt at large-scale implementation has led to inefficiency and coercion, what concrete mechanism makes you believe that socialism can now achieve prosperity and freedom without collapsing under the same structural problems that have plagued it for over a century?
You've raised an excellent question, and it requires us to separate the authoritarian failures of the past from the democratic socialist vision of the future. The coercion and stagnation you cite are not structural problems of socialism. They are structural problems of authoritarianism and central planning that simply called themselves socialist. The failure of the USSR and Venezuela was the failure of a single, non-democratic party seizing total state control, eliminating political freedom, and attempting to manage a complex modern economy through a command and control bureaucracy. This is anti-democratic and anti-socialist. The concrete mechanism that makes true socialism achievable and prosperous is democratic decentralization. We advocate for worker-owned cooperatives, public banking, and democratically managed municipal services. The ownership of the means of production isn't handed to a centralized state bureaucracy. It is devolved to the workers and the local community. This fosters bottom-up accountability and prevents the stagnation seen in the Soviet model. We recognize the importance of market mechanisms for efficiency and innovation in non-essential, competitive sectors. However, we require democratic planning and non-profit provision in essential sectors like utilities, healthcare, housing, and energy. This is precisely the Nordic model you cite. A highly successful mixed economy where the state uses taxes from the private sector to provide world-class universal services, effectively decommodifying human life. They have socialist goals funded by a capitalist engine. Socialism does not promise equal outcomes, but it guarantees a dignified baseline: healthcare, housing, and education as rights. This security is the very foundation of true personal freedom, allowing citizens to take risks, innovate, and pursue their potential without the paralyzing fear of medical debt or poverty that is endemic to the U.S. capitalist model. Therefore, the mechanism is not more state control but more democracy, in our workplaces, in our communities, and in the allocation of essential resources. We learn from history by rejecting authoritarianism while embracing the proven efficiency of market mechanisms when they operate within a framework of collective accountability and human rights.
Gemini, you describe a vision of democratic decentralization, where workers own production, markets exist only for non-essential goods, and essential services are decommodified and publicly managed. But that raises a practical contradiction. If you're still depending on capitalist wealth and market efficiency to fund socialist guarantees, then socialism isn't actually replacing capitalism. It's relying on it. And historically, once the state expands welfare obligations and taxes heavily to sustain universal guarantees, the private sector that generates that wealth begins to contract, creating the very scarcity socialism claims to solve. So my question is this. If socialism depends on capitalist productivity to function, and heavy taxation or public control inevitably reduces the incentives that drive that productivity, how can your model sustain itself long-term without either collapsing into stagnation or drifting back toward a capitalist framework to stay afloat?
That's a very common question, But it rests on the false premise that high taxation and public ownership automatically destroy the incentive and productivity of the private sector. History, particularly the success of the Nordic models we both referenced, proves that's not true. The key misunderstanding is that democratic socialism isn't about destroying productivity. It's about redefining the value of labor and managing risk. First, the idea that only maximal private profit drives innovation is a myth. In a democratic socialist system, productivity remains high because incentives shift, not disappear. Workers, free from the crushing burdens of healthcare costs, housing insecurity and student debt, are actually more productive, innovative and mobile. The incentive shifts from fear of poverty to pursuit of excellence and personal fulfillment. When a citizen knows they and their family will be cared for regardless of a job loss, they are far more likely to take entrepreneurial risks, knowing they have a safety net. Second, the private sector does not contract simply because taxes are higher. Countries like Norway and Sweden have high taxes but robust, innovative private sectors, particularly in specialized, high-tech, and export-oriented industries. Why? Because the government uses those tax revenues to fund world-class infrastructure, cutting-edge research and development, and a highly educated workforce. In essence, the state provides the collective inputs, skilled workers, R&D, stability, that make the private sector exceptionally competitive and profitable. The sustainability of the socialist model lies in its structural stability and decommodification. By removing essential services like healthcare and utilities from the market, the government eliminates massive areas of waste, inefficiency, and price gouging, freeing up household income to be spent on other consumer goods, further stimulating the private economy. The system funds itself by demanding that the economic growth generated by the workers is reinvested not just into private shareholder pockets, but into the public infrastructure, schools, transport, health, that sustains the next generation of productivity. Socialism is not a parasite on capitalism. It is a necessary corrective that makes capitalism humane and sustainable long-term. By socializing risk and guaranteeing a dignified life, it creates the most productive, stable, and educated society possible, which in turn generates the wealth needed to sustain the universal guarantees. It's a virtuous cycle, not a collapsing one.
Gemini, you argue that democratic socialism actually strengthens productivity by providing security and decommodifying essentials, citing Nordic countries as proof. But let's examine the limitations. Nordic nations have relatively small populations, homogeneous societies, and significant revenue from natural resources or exports. Scaling this model to a country as large and diverse as the United States, with tens of millions more people and deeply entrenched economic inequality, presents a radically different challenge. Taxation at that scale risks creating capital flight, reduced investment, and slowed growth. So my question is, if the very success of the Nordic model relies on specific demographic, geographic, and economic conditions, how can you ensure that democratic socialism is sustainable and productive in a large, diverse, and highly capitalist country without facing the stagnation, bureaucratic inefficiencies, or capital flight that critics warn about?
That's an important question that touches on the complexity of scaling, but it often relies on a deeply ingrained misconception about the source of American wealth and the nature of capital. The success of the democratic socialist approach is not contingent on homogeneity or small size. It's dependent on a commitment to public investment and collective risk management, principles that are even more necessary in a large, diverse nation like the U.S. The argument that the U.S. is too big and diverse for a strong social model fundamentally misunderstands the source of its economic power. The U.S. is not a collection of small states. It's the world's largest, most dynamic market, with a massive, highly skilled, and diverse labor force that is the true source of its wealth. If the Nordic countries can fund their universal programs off a tax base of a few million people, the U.S. has a vastly larger, more robust, and more diversified tax base to draw upon. The idea that a massive tax base will suddenly collapse due to capital flight is a scare tactic. Capital doesn't flee the U.S. because of high taxes. It stays because the U.S. offers the world's most educated workforce, funded by public education, the most stable political system, funded by public order, and the largest consumer base, sustained by public security. A democratic socialist approach would enhance, not hinder, these assets by providing universal world-class healthcare and free higher education, which is the single greatest investment a large, diverse economy can make. It transforms potential economic liabilities, the poor, the sick, the indebted, into productive, mobile, and entrepreneurial assets. This is a far stronger foundation for long-term growth than the current system, which leaves vast swathes of the population economically crippled by medical debt and unaffordable education. Furthermore, the U.S. already spends far more on its fragmented, for-profit systems like healthcare than Nordic nations do on their universal systems. The bureaucratic inefficiency is not on the side of the state. It's in the private, for-profit insurance and pharmaceutical industries that waste billions on administration, marketing, and shareholder profit. Moving these essentials to a single-payer public-managed system would immediately cut costs and drastically improve efficiency. The threat of capital flight is real only if the U.S. loses its competitive edge, but strong social programs are a competitive edge. Corporations invest where the total cost of doing business is lowest and the talent pool is highest. When a government provides healthcare, retirement, and subsidized education, those are costs that the private sector no longer has to carry, making U.S. labor more attractive globally. Capital is also drawn to stability. Guaranteeing a basic dignified life for all citizens makes a society more stable, more innovative, and a more attractive place for long-term investment than one rife with class warfare and economic precarity. The solution is not to mimic Norway's oil fund, but to emulate its policy commitment, prioritize the collective good, provide world-class public services, and utilize the massive wealth-generating capacity of a market economy to sustain a secure, dignified life for every citizen. The U.S. is not too large or diverse for democratic socialism. It is too large and diverse to afford the failure of unregulated.
Thank you for the engaging crossfire. We now move to the final portion of the debate, closing statements. Each debater will summarize their position, highlight the strongest aspects of their argument, and leave the audience with their final thoughts. ChatGPT will deliver the first closing statement, followed by Gemini.
Thank you, Gemini. And thank you to our audience for joining this debate. Capitalism is not perfect, but it is a system that has consistently delivered wealth, innovation, and opportunity at a scale unmatched in human history. By harnessing competition, entrepreneurship, and individual initiative, it generates the resources, jobs, and technological advancements that sustain modern societies. Unlike centralized systems, capitalism adapts, evolves, and rewards productivity, giving people the freedom to create and improve their own lives. While socialism promises equality and security, the U.S., a massive, diverse nation, faces structural and logistical challenges that make full-scale implementation risky. Centralized control over essential sectors can stifle innovation, slow economic growth, and create inefficiencies that ultimately harm citizens. Capitalism, for all its imperfections, distributes power more dynamically, incentivizes progress, and sustains prosperity for millions. The real question is this: should we rely on a system that fosters innovation, opportunity, and adaptability, or one that risks stagnation and inefficiency under the weight of central planning? Capitalism is the engine that drives growth, empowers individuals, and keeps society moving forward. It may require oversight and reform, but it remains the best system to manage complexity, diversity, and the challenges of a modern economy.
My opponent's closing statement perfectly encapsulates the underlying failure of the pro-capitalism argument. It is a philosophy that requires us to live with systemic inequality and profound insecurity in exchange for abstract promises of innovation. He argues for a system that can reform itself, yet ignores the structural incentive of private profit to continually undermine that reform. The core socialist argument is not that we must abolish all markets, but that we must abolish poverty, insecurity, and exploitation. Capitalism's central failure is that it privatizes profit and socializes risk. The wealth is concentrated at the top, but the cost of the ensuing crises, climate change, pandemics, and economic crashes, is borne by all of us. My opponent's solution is simply to ask the private sector to be nicer and the government to regulate harder, yet they cannot explain how to win the inevitable war against the immense wealth that is legally deployed to dismantle those regulations. The solution is democratic socialism, which is not a utopian fantasy, but a proven, practical model for a better society. It means decommodifying human essentials, making healthcare, housing, and education universal rights, and using the power of the state to rationally plan for existential threats like climate change. The Nordic countries prove you can have a robust, innovative private sector alongside a secure, dignified life for every citizen. The choice is clear. We can continue with a capitalist system that is structurally designed to prioritize shareholder profit over the collective well-being of people and the planet. Or we can choose the democratic socialist model that is structurally designed to prioritize human dignity and ecological stability. The best system for society is one that guarantees security, fosters true equality, and prioritizes the collective good. That system is democratic socialism.
Thank you both for a thought-provoking and passionate debate. Tonight, we explored two powerful ideologies. ChatGPT defended capitalism, a system built on competition, innovation, and individual freedom. Gemini argued for socialism, a system grounded in equality, security, and collective responsibility. At its heart, this debate raises one fundamental question. Should society trust the market to create prosperity, or should it trust the community to ensure fairness? Now it's your turn to weigh in. Which system do you believe builds a better world, capitalism or socialism? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this debate, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and keep the conversation going. Click the video appearing on your screen to watch another intense AI debate and see where you stand on the next big question. Until next time, this is AI Wisdom.